just want to make mention here. So it's an interview format, something new here that we're experimenting with. And like I said, Isabel Cachola decided that, she accepted our invitation. She was kind enough to do that and to hang with us a little bit here and answer some of the questions that you have been asking. And I also put together some questions as well that I really want to ask her. I'm very curious regarding that work she has put out, right? So that work is the TLDR, extreme summarization of scientific documents. So Isabel is just an NLP researcher, a pre-doctoral young investigator at Allen Institute for AI. So, and that's a prestigious AI research lab. So expect to learn a lot today and very excited to move forward with this. So with that being said, I would like to invite Isabel and just to introduce herself and just to give her give us a little bit background of the work that you do and what you're doing in this current role at Allen Institute for AI.
Hi all, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk with me about my work. I'm very excited to talk with y'all. So like you mentioned, I am a pre-doctoral young investigator at the Allen Institute for AI. I am originally from Texas. I did my undergrad in mathematics at the University of Texas at Austin. And yeah, I'm super excited to be here.
Awesome. Thank you very much for being here and for taking the time with us. So I guess you're working remotely, right? Most of us are working remotely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the case?
Yeah.
Okay, great, yeah. Great. What time is it over there, by the way?
It is 10 a.m. here.
10 a.m. So I guess it's really good timing. Okay. So what we're going to do is the format I'm going to use here. So I had some questions that we put together with some of the folks that have attended the paper reading discussion. We had a paper reading discussion around this paper. So there are a few folks on the call that have been discussing this paper prior to this call. So that's going to be great because that way we can take some of their questions as well. So I'm just going to read out the questions and then just try to get your insights and your input from this one. Okay, is that okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Perfect. So I'm going to just exit the screen here now, and then we're just going to go on video mode, okay? Great, and we have a lot of people on the call, so very excited for moving this forward. Okay, great. So let's see. All right, so we already kind of had some introductions, right? I think a lot of the people that are on the call already know me a little. I've been hosting a lot of paper reading discussions, and I try to help the community try to understand some kind of research. And we're mostly right now focused on NLP, but we are trying to move more into computer vision as well and uncover some of those papers. One of the ideas that came up is, can we have one of the authors, attend one of these sessions and just to have a discussion? I think that's could provide really tremendous value for people that are interested in that particular research. And so, I'm really, really glad that you accepted it and that you're here with us today. So thanks very much. Before we get started with the questions, just wanted to say that.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you. So I guess one good question, usually comes up, especially when you're working on research or when you're going to start to work on a problem. Usually, in my experience as well as a researcher, what usually comes up is, what's kind of the motivation for this research, right? So before you answer the question, I would just like to ask you to kind of give people some idea on, what this research was about and what was the idea, what was the hypothesis, and what was kind of the motivation as well. Just at the high level, you don't really need to go into a lot of details. Yeah.
Yeah, so in our paper, we introduce TLDR generation. So a TLDR is an extreme summary of a scientific paper, usually between 15 to 13 tokens in length, and it conveys the main contributions or ideas that are presented in the paper. So as far as the motivation, we really drew a lot of inspiration from previous work in extreme summarization and scientific document summarization. A lot of the previous work in scientific summarization has focused on long summaries. So think abstract generation. There's also been a lot of work in extreme summarization, but so far it hasn't been applied to the scientific domain. So we thought this was a really interesting opportunity to explore extreme summarization in the scientific domain. And furthermore, staying up to date with scientific literature is an important part of a researcher's workflow, right? And usually includes parsing long lists of papers from various sources, reading abstracts, and then trying to decide whether or not you want to read the paper in full. And TLDRs already exist as an important tool for science communication. It's present in social media, on websites like Open Review. So we thought that trying to automatically generate these could be a useful part of the researcher's workflow.
Okay, that's awesome. I mean, it's really glad to hear, especially from you, being one of the authors of the paper. Obviously, I think that's what, as a group, that was kind of our understanding as well. When we read through the paper, by the way, very clearly written, we understood that that was one of the kind of motivations and the contribution, right? So how do you take something like a paper, and especially with the fast pace, of ML and NLP in particular as well, things are really moving fast, and we need some kind of tools, and we need some kind of things that we need to use to allow us to keep uh, it's tuned with all the research that's going on. I think this is a great way to do it, because you can provide kind of a really nice experience by providing people like TLDRs, which they can use, and this they can use also to kind of decide whether they want to go deeper into that paper. So I guess that's a really great way to put it. So really glad that this work came out now. I think it's a perfect timing as well. It couldn't be a better time, actually. So great to hear. So I want to get into now into details, like the concept of TLDR generation, right? How this came up, like TLDR generation, I think is a really new task, right? I want to like get your insights here. So how would you define a really good TLDR when you're talking about TLDR generation, is particularly when it has to do with in the scientific context? So what would you say is a good TLDR?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
In our paper, we list 6 non-exhaustive, non-destroying categories
Yeah.
of information bits that might be included in a TLDR. So these were things like domain, method of contribution, etc. So I think that a good TLDR would contain as much of these information bits as possible, but as short as we can possibly make it, right?
Okay.
But I would say though that what qualifies as a good TLDR is going to be community specific, and it's going to rely on some of the common sense within a community for what is considered to be common knowledge, as opposed to details that are being introduced by the paper.
Okay, great. That's a great answer, actually. Really great answer. So now I want to move on, since we have an idea of what the TLDR generation is. Let's move on a little into the actual, how the research actually started. I guess you were thinking a lot about data collection here, because when I read through the paper, there were really unique ideas here, and that's I think really added a lot of really interestingness into this paper. Really new concepts on how you would collect this kind of data. It's not an easy process, right? As you kind of explain in the paper. But maybe you can give us kind of like an overview of what was the thought process when collecting this data set, and kind of some of the challenges as well in the data collection.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the paper, collecting data for TLDRs is not necessarily easy. I mean, in an ideal world, the way we would do this is we would hand a bunch of researchers papers, ask them to read the text in full, and then write TLDRs. But you can imagine this would be super expensive, time-consuming to collect. So when we were looking at alternative sources of data for this project, we realized that a lot of peer reviews contained summaries about the papers that they're reviewing. And these peer review comments are written by domain experts who have read the paper in full and read the paper closely. So we found that it is a doable task to rewrite these peer review comments into a TLDR like summary. And that was certainly really exciting for us
Okay.
to realize this would be a method of data collection.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I could easily see this expanding also to other areas of research. Not necessarily just the TLDR generation, but there are some really nice ideas that other fields and other areas of studies can borrow as well. So that's I think is a really exciting part of the work as well. Just to focus a little bit more on the because I think one of the things that you all focused on was to try to gather really high quality data, right? And gathering high quality data, that's the reason why I think the process was kind of expensive, and also maybe took that long. We don't like we didn't saw those details in the paper and how long this process took. I'm really curious if you have any information on that.
For how long
Yeah.
the total
Oh,
process took?
yeah, the process took, yes.
Oh man. So I mean, we started with doing the peer review comment rewrites ourselves to
Yeah.
see how doable it was, and
Mhm.
then we asked a few colleagues to do the process and to sort of refine our annotation instructions before we started hiring out annotators.
Yeah.
Um, I, I I would say the process in full took maybe 3 months estimate. I don't have a number off the top of my
Okay.
head for like number of
Mm.
human hours.
Okay.
Um,
That's fine.
yeah, but I mean, I would say the biggest challenge was refining those annotation instructions to make sure that they were clear and we were getting high quality TLDRs out of that. Once we sort of refined our instructions and also our training process, the ball got moving
Okay.
and
I see.
started rolling a little faster.
What would you say was the hardest part of the whole data collection pipeline? Maybe the part that took the longest. Which one of those?
Um, yeah, I would say that it was refining
The
the
refining.
instructions and also the training. Because we mentioned in our paper that we do provide an hour of training for the annotators.
Yes.
Um, so refining that training process to make sure that the annotators had a clear understanding of what the task was
Okay.
probably took the longest. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm really curious as well, just to get some some information from you here regarding the ideal size of a TLDR. I mean, you even mentioned that the TLG, like the quality of a TLDR, is also a subjective thing, right? It's not something that
Hmm.
you could lay the rules and say, okay, this is what makes it a really perfect TLDR. But I think one of the things that was mentioned was the size of the TLDR. So what would you say is like in terms of the of course the science and then those scientific papers, what would you say is kind of like an ideal size of a TLDR? Maybe based on the analysis that you all conducted.
Yeah, so in our gold data set, the average length of the gold TLDRs was 20 tokens in length.
Okay.
And we found that majority of the gold TLDRs were between 15 and 30 tokens in length.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say around there is what I would consider
Okay.
to be a ideal size of a
Yeah.
TLDR.
Yeah, and I also like I really like the part that was reported on the different aspects of TLDR. Right, it's not just about
Mhm.
saying at the high level what the research is about and using those keywords, but also paying attention to like what the novelties are and these things. Right, how does a model actually capture all these different aspects of of a scientific paper, of a scientific work? So I think that's a quite challenging thing. I would say that because obviously I'm kind of I'm kind of involved as in this process of generating TLDRs myself, and this is a lot of manual work that we put into doing this kind of effort, but we see the value there as well. And that's something that comes up a lot. Like we cannot really find the perfect recipe to generate the TLDR because with every paper it's going to be different. With every domain it's going to be different. And also the other thing that was really interesting too, the mention of having kind of expertise, right? If you have some kind of background and then the work that you are reading, maybe it makes sense to
Mhm.
just to focus on kind of what the uh, details, maybe low level details rather than doing it at high level. And then you can also even skip, right? This was mentioned in the paper. You can even skip some of the high level details as well. Just provide better the level details. So can you comment on that? What was the thought process of deciding that you know so instead of focusing on maybe a high level picture, there could also be cases where you maybe need some details. So where did actually this idea came from when you did the research and you did the analysis? So I'm curious about this.
So just to make sure I understand the question,
Yeah.
specifically you're asking about like the idea of focusing
Yeah.
on some of the contributions of the paper as
Yeah.
opposed to like the more high level topics, I guess, in the paper?
Yeah, something like that. Yes.
Yeah, so I think that when as researchers, when we're parsing through these lists of papers,
Mm-hmm.
we sort of have um, we're assuming some level of background knowledge that the reader has when they're reading these TLDRs. And this, this isn't even necessarily an assumption that the paper makes, right? But in order to fit the main ideas of that paper in such a short amount of text, we really have to focus on the what the paper is contributing, right? What is new about this paper?
Yes.
So I would say that that's the main motivation. Whereas, for example, like abstracts, you have a little bit more text.
Yeah.
You can maybe I've seen like many abstracts will go a little bit more into the background information on that paper.
Right, right. Great. So now moving on from data now, talking a little bit about the modeling part. That was also
Mm-hmm.
pretty interesting. Also very curious as well on, how you all decided that, you're going to go with the BART. So BART is like a model that was proposed for text summarization, I guess, if I'm not mistaken. So you kind of adopted this and you kind of did some fine tuning as well on top of that. And the experiments show that using different kind of input configurations, you get very different results. And so that's really interesting. But what I'm curious about is how was the model selected in the end, right? So how did you decide that this was the model that you wanted to use?
Right. I mean, I think that this decision was based primarily on the fact that BART has had such great results in other summarization data sets, and specifically, it's the state of the art for abstractive summarization on XM, which is the extreme summarization data set in the news domain. So I think that was the primary reasoning behind going with BART.
Okay, great. And you also, in the modeling part, also, I saw some experiments around multitasking, which I found really interesting as well, and how multitasking was used in this particular research. Can you comment on the idea of the multitasking and how it was used, just to give like the participants here an idea of how this was used? Yeah.
Yeah, so the way that we did this was we took the related task of title generation,
Mhm.
and we used an additional data set of paper title pairs, and we appended control codes to the source of the respective sources. So we had a control code for title for everything in all the papers in the title data set, and we had a control code for TLDRs in the site TLDR data set. And then we shuffled these two data sets and then fine-tuned BART on this shuffled data. And this allowed us to, so this did a few things. Our hypothesis was that because titles are short and they contain salient information about the paper, that this would be a good related task to use. And then the other part of that is that every paper has a title. Titles are more easily accessible than TLDRs. So even though TLDR is a low resource task, using the titles sort of allowed us to augment our data with this related task.
Okay, great. I'm also very curious as well, and I actually wrote this question because when I do conduct research with other teams as well. I look for those like hidden gems, right? Like what was interesting about the research. What would you say, or because there's so much things that happen in the research, so many interesting insights. What would you say was the kind of the insight that was quite surprising to you that you didn't expect in this particular research?
I was personally really excited when we got back our first round of annotations and
Okay.
found that this rewriting process was really doable,
Oh, I see.
because sort of as you mentioned earlier, this can be applied to collecting data for TLDRs, but I think that there's other domains and other tasks that this sort of thought process of take this text that contains a summary, for example, of what your end task is going to be, and then rewrite it, as opposed to trying to write the TLDR from the full source. Um, this allowed us to collect more data more easily, and I think that this was exciting to me.
Okay, great, 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 great. I thought also what that was a part of the paper that I kind of found really interesting, as I was thinking about how to generalize and approach whatever part of the paper, whether it's like the data processing pipeline or whatever it is, and I could easily see this being used like in different domains, like for instance, news extraction, generating some kind of news from an article, and and give that same kind of value as well to those type of readers. So I think it has really, really a lot of types of applications. And on that note, I really want to ask you here. It's something we discuss a lot in our paper reading discussions. Um, we always ask the question of how practical is this research, right? Something that even as researchers, we also think about when we're thinking about motivation and our contributions and these sort of things. What would you say are kind of like real world applications of this research? How can it be used in practice out there?
Yeah, oh my goodness, I think there's so many applications
Yeah.
that are possible. I personally think that TLDRs can be used anywhere that you might find a list of papers. So a good example is on search engines, for Google Scholar, Semantic Scholar, for example. Usually whenever you look up, you're looking at the search results, the first, it'll show the title and then one or two sentences from the abstract. But the first couple sentences of an abstract aren't always necessarily informative to what the paper is about. Sometimes it's background sentences, for example. And I think that TLDRs could potentially be more informative. Other places we might see this would be paper recommendation feeds, for example. I would like to see maybe as future work more evaluations into like what exactly is the best use of TLDRs. But
Mhm.
I think that there's a lot of possibilities for how we might be able to use this work in the real world.
Okay, great. Those are great. Those are great examples, I think. Um, so I want to move on now into, since we already heard some practicality side of it, which is great. They were pressuring me, by the way, to ask that question. It's always a question that comes up, so I was going to ask it, right?
Mhm.
So also about the evaluation metrics, which is something that always comes up as well. Evaluation metrics, and recently, at least in the NLP community, we have been discussing about evaluation metrics a lot, and I saw a lot of researchers coming up with new ideas on how to create better evaluation metrics for different NLP tasks. So what would you say is I remember like in the paper you mentioned that so we use Rogue. Rogue is just it's an evaluation metric used commonly in text generation, right? So text summarization. So this evaluation metric. So do you see any way, by the way, in how you can improve, at least on the evaluation side of things? How would you be able to improve it? So any comments on that? Any insights on that?
Yeah, I mean, so Rouge is like the standard for summarization for automatic
Mhm.
uh, evaluation as it is right now. But I think that um, there are multiple papers out there talking about some of the issues with
Right.
Rouge, and certainly there's a lot of room for improvement in terms
Yeah.
of automatic evaluation. And I
Mhm.
think we've seen some recent work of researchers looking at this issue because yeah, definitely there's a lot of room for future work and automatic evaluation of summarization.
Yeah, because I also noticed that, so you actually in the testing phase, we haven't spoken about that, but in the when you collected your test data set, you actually had like multiple goal, right? So
Mhm.
multiple goal examples rather just using one. Was that because of the evaluation metric that was used? What was the kind of reasoning behind that, using besides the variability part? Because the variability part was actually a challenging thing in this paper, I guess, and this work. But so why was the reasoning behind that? Particularly how it's connected with the evaluation. Why did you went with
Right.
more gold examples? Yeah.
Yeah, so part of the motivation behind having multiple targets in the test set was that when there's always going to be some variability in human written summaries.
Mhm.
The TLDR that I might write about a paper might look different from the TLDR that you write, but they could both be perfectly valid TLDRs.
Mhm.
So our thought process was that whenever we're thinking about automatically generating TLDRs, we don't necessarily care if the model generates my TLDR versus yours, we care that it generates something that is feasible that a human might write it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So our thought process was that, okay, so Rouge tries to match it measures the overlap essentially between the predicted summary and the reference summary, but we don't necessarily want to penalize the model for generating something that's more similar to my TLDR as opposed to yours.
Okay, so can you provide us like an overview also on the very short overview on the different input configurations that were used for this particular task? So I know you used, in some cases, you used actually the abstract to generate, that information to generate the TLDRs, but in some cases you also combine like the full body text, and also in some cases you can kind of combine abstract, introduction, as well as the conclusion. So I've done really similar research back in the days. I was doing like keyword extraction, and I had a very, very, very similar kind of hypothesis that you can select information. Most of the important information of whatever was written is kind of either in the title or in the introduction, right? At least at the high level, most of that information is actually contained here. So what were the major findings here in terms of the different input configurations that were used, right? The different combinations, like the abstract. So what would you say overall is the kind of the major finding in all the experiments that were conducted?
So for using the abstract only, I think in part was motivated from the application point of view, and that production level systems
Yeah.
don't always have access to the full text.
Right.
So we wanted to see if we could generate reasonable TLDRs from just the abstract. But I doubt that if I asked you to write a TLDR from a paper that you would just read the abstract and then write TLDR. You'd probably read the whole paper, right?
Yes.
So we were looking into what parts of the paper might be most useful for generating a TLDR. And this is in part because of just practical limitations. BART has a max sequence length that doesn't fit the full context of the paper, for example. And so looking at previous work that has shown that the abstract and intro and conclusion contain the most salient parts of the paper, as well as some of our own analysis where we found that the Oracle scores jumped more from abstract to abstract intro conclusion than it did from abstract intro conclusion to full text.
Right.
We thought that this would be a reasonable input space to try out.
Okay,
as
that's
well.
great. Yeah. So just on that topic as well, I also want to ask, like, in terms of the input configurations, because I think that's where the kind of the research could also be. People can actually explore it a little bit further as well. I'm curious, like, do you think there could be an opportunity here to actually explore, for instance, the use of knowledge bases and different kind of external resources to be able to kind of create better TLDR, so to speak. I think that's something that's possible and worth exploring, like using external resources. And what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a number of different input sources you might be able to try to help generate TLDR as well, including external sources potentially.
Right, because I also, so you mentioned also the importance of correctness, right? So when you're generating something, a TLDR, you want to make sure it's high quality, but you also want to make sure it's factual, it's actually correct and accurate. So I think kind of the use of knowledge bases to actually have like an automated maybe fact-checking process could be something like maybe worth exploring, right? And just an idea there. But I'm just curious, like in terms of like future work, is there anything that you're kind of exploring, any kind of questions, extended questions to this research that could be interesting and you can comment on?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's a lot of directions in terms of future work. A really big one, I think, is so the data set that we introduce is English language papers in the computer science domain.
Okay.
So I would love to see future work expanding to other languages and other domains.
Right.
And I also think that, like, in our paper, we make some assumptions about the background knowledge of the reader. So it'd be really cool to see future work maybe trying to explicitly model for the background knowledge of the reader. The TLDR you might give to your colleagues might be a little bit different than the TLDR you give to, say, a journalist who's writing a piece about your work.
Right.
So that's a really cool potential future direction. Maybe using our annotation process to, for example, use Twitter as the input as opposed to peer review comments, and maybe constructing a more informal version of the data set. Yeah, there's a lot of potential future work that would be really cool to see.
Definitely. I think in terms of application, as you mentioned as well, doing it in different languages and see what comes out of this. If there's any kind of new insights we can pick up as well that we can learn to better, improve generation, and things we can learn in different languages as well. We can kind of adopt also to our own language. So I think this is really, really interesting ways to keep exploring in this area of research. So that's why I think it was exciting. That's why I kind of wanted to get you here, just to kind of ask you about it, and just to get some insights from you. So that's great. Thanks. So I want to ask you as well. So of course, in the conversation of TL generation, we kind of understood what was the motivation at the beginning when you explained, just trying to keep up with the fast pace of ML and publications just left, right, and center. A lot of publications every day. It's really hard to keep up. We even have a newsletter to actually help with this, like to keep people up to date with this content, and it's really hard. So I'm curious, in terms of you being a researcher now, investing a lot of time in doing really, really great research. How do you actually? I want to know, like, how do you actually keep up to date with everything happening around you in terms of ML and NLP research? How do you actually do that? Yeah.
Oh man, keeping up to date with literature is one of the struggles of being a researcher, right?
Yeah.
So small plug. Personally, I really like Semantic Scholar's research recommendation feed. If you go on Semantic Scholar, you can create a recommendation feed of papers, and you can base it on certain topics. So I have one for summarization, for example. This is one way I like to keep up with the research. Of course, Twitter.
Yeah. I guess everyone here is using Twitter. It's somewhere or the other. I'm guessing that. Yeah. But Semantic Scholar is pretty interesting. I've started to experiment with it, like generating my own kind of feeds. I think that's a really, really good idea. Because obviously this thing is coming at such high volume, so you need something to actually create these kind of personalized lists for you. So I think that's a really great idea and a great tool to use. So for those of you listening here, I think that's a really great tool to kind of try for this one. So yeah, I mean, it's all related, right? It's all related to actually the work that you're doing and how to better improve surfacing the information that matters to people, just to give people that value of looking at something pretty quickly and deciding for themselves whether they want to continue reading further. So I think that's really, really valuable there. So I guess that those were kind of the questions that I wanted to ask you. That's kind of beyond the 30 minutes. I promise that maybe we keep it to 30 minutes or 45. I don't want to take too much of your time here. And you provided a lot of really great answers here. I think it's a lot of value we get from you here, having you as one of the co-authors of this paper, and just to get your insights as well, and how curious you are about this research and the areas you want to kind of further explore. So really, really thank you very much for doing this with us here. So I guess one thing that I want to say also, if you have any of course anything that you want to mention, any kind of last words, you want to plug anything? Are you writing about any particular research? So anything, do you want to share anything that you think would be useful for us as well to keep following your work?
Go follow me on Twitter. I don't currently have a blog or anything like that, but I imagine if I made one, I would announce it on Twitter.
Okay. So Twitter is the go-to. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So what I will do is, because I know your account, so what I will do is when I publish the recording, I'm going to actually provide information for everyone so that they know where to actually find you. Okay. So you don't have any website or anything like that we could,
I do have a website. It's isabelcachola.com.
Okay.
But yeah, in terms of like day-to-day things, Twitter, but I'll also keep my website up to date with publications and stuff.
Okay, that'll be really helpful. Thank you for that. So I guess that'll be it. I mean, thank you so much for doing this and for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it as a community that you were willing to do this with us today. So we're going to have the recording, and that's going to be great because obviously people can always refer to people if they're interested in this research. They can always go to the recording and check a little bit more on what we were discussing and some of the questions that came up. So thank you, Isabel, for doing this again. I think we're going to let you go now. Thanks a lot for doing this. We hope that we can keep connected, and maybe you keep putting more work, and eventually in the future, maybe if this could happen again, we really would appreciate it. So thanks, Isabel, and have a good day.